The Soviets were very happy to see him because one of the things he was doing was he was looking for some what he called breathing space between Canada and the United States. And what better way to do it than to reach out to the Soviets and the Chinese? And as a matter of fact...
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. I'm Scotty Greenwood with the Canadian American Business Council, about to drop the puck with Chris Sands of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Hey, Chris.
Hi, Scotty. Great to see you. It's even better to see you at a face-off.
We're at a face-off on Canusa Street.
We are at a face-off on
We're going to have fun. We're going to talk about hockey, diplomacy, the world, and we have such a distinguished couple of guests. I'm very excited. Why don't you introduce them properly, Chris?
Well, first, a little bit of context, because we are going to be talking with Ambassador Gary J. Smith, who's a former Canadian career ambassador and diplomat with over 30 years of service beginning in 1968, more than 20 years of which were spent abroad during 8 different assignments, including the UN in New York, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Israel during the return of Sinai to Egypt, India following the Air India explosion in 1985, Germany when the Berlin Wall fell, and Indonesia involving the Bre-X gold scandal. So you pretty much, I hope...
What do all these things have in common?
Gary Smith, the master of disaster.
I have trouble, yeah. Just the right guy in the wrong place.
We don't want to be assigned with you. And also, Chris, we are in studio here in Washington, D.C., and you're going to explain that, but it's lovely to be here in person.
It is lovely to be here in person, but I have buried the lead because the particular reason that we have Ambassador Smith here is that he is the author of a new book on the 1972 Canada-Soviet Union hockey series, Ice War Diplomat, Hockey Meets Cold War Politics at the 1972 Summit Series, a book that has a U.S. edition coming out, so our listeners in the States will find it in their favorite place of buying books.
Book and a movie.
And a movie.
You were about to say that, I think.
There's a documentary as well. Now... I always like to go into a meeting with someone as this distinguished with backup, and we also have a second guest who is backup. No one knows hockey as well as my friend Dr. Andrew Holman.
You're the Pips to our Gladys Knight, apparently.
Yeah,
right,
definitely.
Andrew? Yeah.
Andrew Holman is professor of history and director of the Canadian Studies program at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. He's been a member of the history department at BSU since 1996 and is the director of the university's Canadian Studies program. He teaches courses on Canadian and U.S. history, as well as scholarly articles, reviews, books on topics such as sport history, historiography, history of education. Now, I know in particular that he is the author of Hockey, A Global History. Not his first book on hockey, and I hope not his last, but one that gives us a global context to how important this sport is and how it's evolved in the various countries around the world. So we have a doubleheader. I guess that's baseball, but we have a really great group.
we have a good discussion, and I'm
Back to
excited.
back, sure.
There you go. And, you know, what self-respecting Canada-U.S. podcast would go as long as we've gone, Chris, without talking about hockey and diplomacy? So
we didn't want to be too obvious.
That's right. So we're going to get right into it. I know our guests are...
Boy,
Yeah.
I don't understand it.
There we go. So we're here in studio because the Wilson Center has put together a wonderful talk about your book, Ambassador. Maybe I'll just start with a question to both of our guests, starting with you, Ambassador, which is a broad one. What role do you think sports plays in international relations generally?
Well, I think sports is good politics and it's good business. There's lots of money involved. And the beauty of sports is that it is a broader and deeper relationship in finding common ground around the world than a lot of other things, than scientific exchanges, educational exchanges, the fine arts, music, and so on. Sports really connects everybody, and it's a great vehicle. So in this particular case, Canadians love hockey, and Russians love hockey.
Yeah.
And therefore, it was the perfect medium, the perfect common ground to try and do something politically between Canada and the Soviet Union back in 1972.
Absolutely. And we're going to get into that in a second. Professor Holman, I had the great pleasure a couple of weeks ago of here in Washington of being on the National Mall to host a polo match. And 61 countries were represented by their embassies, and polo has different connotations depending on where you are in the world. But Argentina really considers itself to be the world capital of polo. So I have a sense that sports and diplomacy really go well together. But you're a leading scholar on hockey and hockey history.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you come down on the role of sports in global relations and global understanding, just generally? And then we'll get into the specifics of what happened, the magical moment in 1972.
Yeah. Well, I think I would echo Ambassador Smith's comments about sport being, at least having the potential to be a kind of international calling card for a nation. It's also fraught with difficulty. If things don't go well, if players, fans misbehave, you run the risk of having some kind of negative backlash, of course. But there's something about sport that's a little bit different than, let's say, any other kind of cultural pursuit as a kind of international calling card. I'm thinking about my friend and colleague John Soares, who writes about diplomatic history in sport and says, you can debate the merits of a Copeland piece or Shostakovich, but there's no debating who won a hockey game. And so in terms of having this kind of acute calling card aspect, I think hockey certainly has that. Other sports do, of course, as well. But hockey has the potential to be that imprint leaving vector, if you will.
Absolutely. And the modern Olympic movement isn't enough, right? I think what we've learned from the Olympics is about playing sports instead of fighting wars. But once every 4 years, Chris Sands is not enough for hockey. We were there in 2010 in Vancouver for the gold medal game, in which it was Canada versus the United States. And final game, and if Canada didn't win, I think Vancouver would have, and Canada would have had a nervous breakdown, and Vancouver would have gone up in flames or something. You're right, Professor. It is an interesting moment when fans behave or don't behave, or how it affects people. But the Olympics aren't enough. So, Chris, maybe over to you to get into the details of this fabulous book.
Just to come back for a moment on the Olympics, because it's pride and prestige as well. Mm-hmm, and there's a great effort to put your best forward to win medals. And sometimes it goes over the edge. If you look back, for instance, in 1972 at the Munich Olympics, you had a great competition between the Soviet Union and the United States to see who would win the medals, and also between the two Germanys. It was East Germany versus West Germany. Yeah. And it was about pride. Whose system is better? And that's where we got into the whole doping side of things. The East Germans were specialists at that. They won many, many, many more medals than West Germany in the Munich Olympics. By cheating, by picking out people early on, training them, using a lot of drugs. And they had a third the population of the West Germans, and yet came third in the Olympics. Was really incredible. So there's that side of carrying flags, doing whatever you need to do to win. And so that's where sometimes there's a downside to the sports diplomacy part of things.
Sure.
Well, let me ask you, Ambassador, to take us back to that moment in 1972. I know some of our listeners, that's ancient history for them. They won't have been around at that time. What was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union? Where were we in the Cold War? And how did Canada see that tension and respond to it?
Well, I think when Pierre Elliott Trudeau came to power in 1968, he was looking to change things. He was worried about the Cold War. And so he made an overture to China, to People's Republic with Mao Zedong, recognized them in October 1970, concerned about the Soviet Union, and, we'd come out of the Cuban Missile Crisis and invasion of Czechoslovakia. So he wanted to reduce tensions with them. And what better way than to go on a visit? So he became the first Canadian Prime Minister to go to the Soviet Union. And he went for 12 days, and the Soviets were very happy to see him, because one of the things he was doing was he was looking for some, what he called, breathing space between Canada and the United States. Mm-hmm. And what better way to do it than to reach out to the Soviets and the Chinese. And as a matter of fact, during that visit in May 71, he signed a protocol on consultations that unnerved people here in Washington, saying, what's he up to? So while
And
we
were
had-
you there? Just a quick. Were you there?
Yes, I was.
Posted in Moscow at
Yes,
the time.
I
So you
was.
had something to do with this.
Yes, and we also, this was a period when Nixon and Kissinger were reaching out to China, ping pong
Right.
diplomacy,
Right.
and trying to play what was called the China card against the Soviet Union. And in sort of reverse, the Soviets said, hey, look at this Canadian coming over here. He's friendly to us. Moreover, he's got American technology in Canada. Maybe we can get to American technology through the back door. So the Soviets played a Canadian card against the U.S. playing a China card. And that's the big sort of strategic situation.
And, you know, it's so interesting because you're talking about the 1970s, and Chris was saying some of our listeners may not have been born in the 70s. It's true. But fast forward to today, Andrew, the politics of the world have some of the same players. The Soviet Union,
Russia.
China, now Russia, China, the U.S., and what Canada can do. But anyway, maybe just to talk about the 1972 and that. So Ambassador talked about the period in response to Chris's question.
Mm-hmm.
How does the hockey game fit in? Set the stage for us there? What was that all about?
Sure. Well, the Soviets were relative newcomers to the sport of hockey. Canadian hockey had been introduced as early as the 30s, but in terms of them taking it up as a serious endeavor, it wasn't until after the Second World War that they did, and they did in a hurry. And
The Soviets.
They sure did. In
Yeah, okay.
1954, winning the World Championship, which was a great surprise to everyone, including Canadians, who thought that the sport was theirs. And so this new force bursting on the scene of international hockey was something to be reckoned with. Canadians could console themselves for some time that, well, we're not sending our best over there. We're sending the winner of the Allen Cup the year before, or in the case of 1954, it was the East York Lyndhursts, who were a senior B team.
Interesting.
And so,
yeah.
it was the overconfidence perhaps that Canadians had that they could send over just any kind of team and they'd still come away with the gold. And
Yeah, but in 72, it was a bunch of future Hall of Famers that went, right?
it sure was, yeah. And so what happened was Canadians, after some time, began to tire of, and particularly people like Alan Eagleson and others, to tire of the Soviet success and of Canadians not doing so well. There was a national team project led by Father David Bauer in the 1960s, an attempt to establish a new kind of model for recruiting players. But the difficult part was always that the best amateur players were very quickly claimed or gobbled up by professional teams.
By the NHL.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so maintaining the amateur status of the very best players was something that Canadians just couldn't seem to manage. And so finally it led to this groundswell of opinion and a push to have best-on-best series between what were by then the world's two best hockey powers. And I suspect Ambassador Smith is going to be very humble about this, but the actual bringing about of this series, the negotiations that had to take place so you could actually get best on best for 8 games in September 1972 wasn't like snapping the fingers. And I think I know I'm richer from having read all the details in this book about how it came about. Hockey historians will be, everybody who reads it will be, and so I would invite him to speak more about just how difficult those kind of negotiations would have been to bring about this best on best.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador,
Well,
I think that's a handoff. That's
a handoff.
Not a
Passing
two-line
the
pass.
puck,
Yeah.
he's passing the puck, and I'm
Tape to
supposed to
tape.
shoot it, right? That's it, tape to tape. Yeah, well, that was the problem at the time, was the amateurs. They called themselves amateurs, but they were in the Army or the Air Force or security services. They did way more training than any Canadian or American basketball player at the time as well. In 72, the U.S. went to Munich Olympics with college people who had never played together before against this great Soviet team. And so we were really handcuffed by the International Olympic Committee and the International Ice Hockey Federation. No to professional. So how did we get around that? Given the desire in Canada that, we've got to get our prestige back here. We've got to pull ourselves up off the floor. And the result was that we worked out the idea, okay, we're going to have just a bilateral series of games. No international games, nobody else, just between Canada and the Soviet Union, and it's going to be an exhibition series. There'll be no trophy, right?
Okay,
We're not playing for a trophy. We're just playing best on best. And the Russians called it the Druzhba series, the friendship series. So that's how we were able to get around all the obstacles of the International Ice Hockey Federation and the Olympic Committee. Said best versus best in an exhibition series, 4 games in Canada and 4 in the Soviet Union. And that's what made it unique in a sense, because the Olympics are always in one locale, right?
Right.
They're in Canberra or in Vancouver or Atlanta. But this was a traveling series.
Yeah.
And we had 4 games in Canada, September 2nd, 4th, 6th, and 8th in Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. And then we went back 2 weeks later to play 4 games in Moscow. Originally, they were going to move it around there, too, but they had security problems and transit problems.
So kind of like the Stanley Cup or,
in
different cities or the World Series, where you go back and forth.
Well, yeah, except that we're traveling across the world, and we're taking with us 3,000 Canadian fans.
Oh, really?
Boisterous fans who were looking for a big Grey Cupski party, which is let's get down and dirty and drink a lot and have a great time.
I hope that some of the fans that went to that game will somehow find their way to this podcast and ping us, because that would be really fun as a follow-up. Anyway, keep going.
Well, sure. I've been in touch with some of them in recent days, and they're still keen. They're still having reunions.
Sure.
Because it was a fabulous event. I think for about $650, you got airfare from, say, Toronto to Moscow. You got 10 days accommodation, all meals, 4 tickets to the 4 games, sightseeing around the city, went to the Bolshoi and the circus and so on. And people just flocked. I think we could have sold, instead of 3,000, we could have sold 6, 7, 8, 9,000 tickets.
Amazing.
But the arena was only 13,000. And the Russians, they wanted to load it up with all their Communist Party friends.
Right.
And so the average Russian fan never even got close to the arena.
Well, and Chris, I promised to hand this over to you, but just one more thing about that. As I listened to an interview with Paul Henderson, who is the iconic Canadian hockey player who ends up winning. I think there's no spoiler here. This is something everybody knows, but he scores several goals, including the winning goal. But in listening to him, the Canadian team, I think, was a little self-confident. It was Canadian players who hadn't played together as a team, and they came together for this purpose, whereas the Soviets had been training together, and the Canadians came in thinking that they were going to just basically sweep. And man, it didn't go down like that at all, did it?
It didn't, no.
No, it was going to be an 8-game sweep on our side. The Globe and Mail correspondent, Dick Beto, said, if the Soviets win 1 game, I'll eat my column in a bowl of borscht on the steps of the Russian embassy.
Did he do it?
And
did you make him do it?
He did right after the very first game.
That's disgusting.
The very first game. So he had to do that. And it's true what Paul Henderson said. We picked our best players from the Canadian and American teams. There were, I think, 14 at the time, 11 in the U.S. and 3 in Canada. But they all hated each other.
Yeah.
They were fighting, as hockey was the big thing in those days, lots of fights. And they were duking it out with each other. And then all of a sudden they were thrown together.
Right. And
said, you got to be friends, you got to work together. And it's in the summer when they're all drinking beer. We had no training programs. The Soviets had this great, under Anatoly Tarasov, had a great training system. They had diet as well. There were certain foods that you had to eat.
You see, kids, your nutrition makes a difference in your physical well-being. I hope my son has tuned into this.
The Canadian players, as soon as they finished playing in May, just went on the road, started drinking, got out of shape. And, as I said, drank a lot of beer, ate a lot of French fries and hamburgers, and were in terrible shape. And normally you get ready in training season in September to get the weight down and get your skills back. Yeah, that's it.
Play your way into shape.
Into shape. Yeah. But they weren't. They weren't in shape. And so all this, they had also sent over a coach to the Soviet Union that I went with to a game. They saw only one game, and he said the Russian goaltender was a sieve. He let in 8 goals. I said, but it's his wedding tomorrow. He's got his mind on other things. Doesn't matter. We're going to clean up on all these guys. So that scouting report came back. This great self-confidence, all the media, as I mentioned.
That Canadian arrogance, Chris.
We really carry it around. And we were going to clean up.
Hockey, I think that's a fair.
We felt we were the world's best, and we were going to do it. And so on September 2nd, 1972 in Montreal, we scored 2 goals in the first 6 minutes, and everyone thought this is going to be a romp. And they came back and won 7-3.
Yeah.
Everybody in Canada was flummoxed. Despair. This was going to be our moment, and it wasn't. We were going to win big, and instead we lost big. So it was a national trauma. And for the 27 days in September, everybody in Canada watched this series.
Yeah.
And indeed, and Canada came to a halt on the final game on September 28. School kids were herded into gyms with small TV sets, and they watched it. Business stopped. People lined up at stores outside to have access to a TV.
Well, hang on a second. Andrew Holman, you were a kid in St. Catharines, Ontario.
Lockview Public School. I remember
Tell us
that. We
about
were
it.
all gathered into, I can't recall. I don't remember, knowing its importance at the time, but these images that we have, where were you when? It was one of those where were you when moments, and I'm thankful to those teachers who herded us into the auditorium to watch this little black and white screen with the wavy lines and everything. But
were you playing hockey back then?
I think
not
I was.
Yet?
Yes, I'd started
Pee-wee
at
hockey
5,
or
and I think I was 7 or something.
Yeah.
It was a bad transmission from Moscow.
It was awful.
The sound was terrible, and you thought,
gee,
the screen's going to disappear. I'm not going to see this game. But everyone in the country watched it. And you know what? We estimated in the embassy 150 million Soviets watched this series too.
Wow.
They were transfixed by it because they had a steady diet of propaganda on Soviet television.
Sure.
And so they loved it when sports came up. And hockey, number 1 or number 2 sport in the Soviet Union. So we really reached a lot of homes and a lot of people, and that was part of our purpose.
Sure.
Was to use this to show that we weren't the bad capitalists that the leaders were saying. And
we're communists just like you.
well, maybe you could say that about a few. But the thing is that the Soviet goalie who was getting married the next day for practice, 20 years old, Vladislav Tretiak, he came over and he put a human face on communism.
Yeah, sure.
Johnny Esau, the interviewer, said, he said, Vladislav, Canadians think you're wonderful. And all of a sudden, this feeling that the communists are nasty and dirty and so unlike us, here was this bright young guy playing our game extremely well. And that's where the stereotypes broke down.
I want to put this to you.
Just to finish, if I could, Chris. And wonderfully, he was and is. I had the chance to meet him 6 years ago in Moscow, and warm, full of humor, very tactile, lots of hugging, that sort of thing. Maybe that had something to do with the vodka, right?
Talking,
but, I don't think the Soviet Union then and Russia now could have a better ambassador for their game than Tretiak.
Is he still mad about that goal?
No, I don't think so. But I really didn't have the temerity to bring it up.
Well, I'll tell you, in this film that we're going to see part of called Icebreaker, I went to Moscow last year with the film director, and we got Tretiak to go to the very arena, and he reenacted that final goal.
Wow.
He walked his way. There was no ice time, but he walked his way down to where he stood in the Soviet net, and he played the last minute.
Oh my gosh.
Like this, and the puck's over here, and there's a bad play by my defenseman Vasilyev over here. Cornway gets it to Esposito, and it's in front of, and I make a save, and then Henderson gets the puck again, and he scores with 34 seconds to go. for Canada to win because
On a rebound.
on a rebound of Henderson's own shot. And you mentioned that Henderson scored the winning goal. He also scored the winning goal in Game 7 and Game 6, which were all one-goal victories. And we needed to win each and every one of those games because we were down.
And his teammates all wanted the puck. You know, these guys are all phenomenal hockey players. And to hear him tell it, you know, they all say, give me the puck. You know, we're down. And he got it.
Well, he called off Peter Mahovlich.
That's right, Peter Mahovlich.
Peter, get off. I just feel I'm going to do something.
And but the way he tells it, Mahovlich thought it was like the coach yelling at him. He doesn't think because they were coming from the same direction. Anyway, Chris, you're never going to get a word in edgewise here, my friend.
No, but I'm having a lot of fun. But I will ask a question for you, Andrew. There's something about the way in which hockey has a sort of cultural resonance. This is not, with all due respect to polo or tennis or other sports, this is a popular sport for the lunch bucket crowd, for the blue-collar worker, for the kids playing in neighborhoods. How did that shape the way that this was viewed by ordinary Canadians, maybe by ordinary Soviets and Americans who are watching this? Just the fact that it was a sport that really resonated with them and was relatable.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, the myth, part of the myth of Canadian hockey and Canadians' claim to hockey being their game is this whole idea that it's attached to winter, that it's a way that Canadians have defeated winter or owned it or appropriated it in some way. And that has existed, I think, in the discourse since the late 19th century right to the present day. And so maybe like the British with the first industrial revolution, we got stuck. And innovation was something that didn't come along, that Canadians maybe didn't adjust their game as quickly as they might have done through the middle decades of the 20th century. And why would they if they were still at the top of in their own view, the top of the world? But what the Summit Series does is to, in a broad sense, convince Canadians that there's some merit in sharing their game with the world, and that there's also something to be learned in terms of strategy and tactics. And so in the book that I've co-authored with Steve Hardy on global hockey history, we mark this transition, this period of convergence that comes. This is certainly something that Ambassador Smith talks about in his own book, how the Summit Series changes hockey forever, that we see this kind of convergence that takes place. European hockey, which had been played in certain ways, becomes, in some measure, a little bit more physical. We begin to see some of the North American quote-unquote tactics being employed there. But even more markedly is the importation of European Soviet tactics and the importation of European Soviet players as well.
Yeah.
They carry this cultural transfer with them over to North America. And the result, 50 years later, is a much better game than it was before. It's faster. It's more aggressive. We went through a kind of a period from about 1972 until 1987 or thereabouts where physicality became and intimidation became the way to win games. The Broad Street Bullies of Philadelphia in the 1974-75 and the Big Bad Bruins in the late 1970s. That's run its course. And now the game is much, much more about stick and puck and speed and less so about physicality. Except when we get to the playoffs, then we see a different thing come about.
Get down to the playoffs, yeah.
Let me ask you both a question then, because I'm trying to situate this. I remember the Cold War. There were the chess tournaments.
Yes,
that was a source of pride. We went through obviously Olympic hockey. How did this particular series though relate to all of that? Why was this so memorable and in some ways so pivotal, both for global diplomacy and the sport itself?
Well, I think it was pivotal because it meant so much to Canada. It's in, hockey's in our DNA. And as Professor's saying, we were losing. Our pride was hurt. We knew we were better, but we couldn't put our best players forward. And therefore, there was year after year after year of losing to the Soviets. And so there's this great dimension. And when it happened, that's why there was such a massive following. And same on the Soviet side, they knew they were winning world championships, but they hadn't played the best.
Yeah.
And they knew that the best was on this side. So on the hockey front, there was a sort of collision of interests. And that's why it got so much attention.
So can I just jump in? This was a gutsy move on your part. I'm just picturing it. Here you are, a young Canadian diplomat in Moscow. You've just described that Canada knows it's better, but isn't able to play best on best. So you come up with this idea, and it had to be, and then Canada is only not sweeping, but could lose. I mean, what would have happened? What was going through your mind at the time? Because, again, Paul Henderson was sure they would win, but it was damn close. But he was on the ice. What was going through your mind? Like, were you thinking, holy moly, what have I done? What if we lose? I'm going to get recalled to Canada and sent, or worse, left here?
I'll tell you, one thing I mentioned in the book was that one day I received a phone call at the embassy, and it was from the top diplomat, say, in the State Department, calling to speak with me. And I said, why would he want to speak to me? I'm the lowest guy on the, in the hierarchy here. And said, no, he needs to speak to you, and he wants to speak to you directly. And he said, Gary, what the hell's going on over there in those negotiations? And I want to remind you of one thing. Your job is to keep this series on the rails. And so it wasn't my job to have us win or lose.
Well,
I wasn't on the ice.
But it was.
It was to keep the series going to the end, because there were 4 or 5 instances where this thing may have collapsed.
Really?
Including in the very end when there was a massive argument about referees.
Sure.
And the Canadian manager, Alan Eagleson, was threatening to go home. And this is it. If we don't get the referees we want, we're going home. Mm-hmm. And so there was my job. So, oh, my God, we got all these fans here. We go home. We're sore losers. I don't get my job done of keeping it on the rails. So that's where my push was. And I got to make a proposal on the referees. I said, how about you choose one and we'll choose one.
Classic move.
It was, except there were the KGB agents in the room. And we said, we're going to take the Swedish referee. And they smiled and said, well, he's sick. He said, well, we just saw him for breakfast.
Yeah, he seems fine.
He was fine.
God.
He said, well, he's sick now. And
Wow.
we knew it was a political illness. And we were euchred on that particular
Holy moly.
instance. So we picked the check, and they took a West German who was atrocious. And there were a lot of shenanigans in the final game. So my eyes were to keep this thing going from a diplomatic point of view, because it was between Canada, the Soviet Union, the leadership at the top, Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Trudeau, and that was their goal, to find the common ground in hockey. And if we had quit, even if we lost, it would have been all right, because in the end, the Soviets lost. But they said the real winner of this series was the game of hockey itself.
Okay, but Andrew, you're a historian, and Ambassador respectfully didn't really answer my question about culturally, what if Canada had lost? Yeah. Like, good job, Ambassador, keeping it on the rails and,
so
getting
the question
the
is, does the convergence in terms of the hockey world, the coming together, happen if 72 doesn't happen at all?
And also Canadians' sense of themselves and the role they play in the world, kind of, in using hockey as a diplomatic tool.
Yeah, I think it would have happened sooner or later in some form, whether it came in the form of visiting clubs or whether it came in some other national team tournament format. It would have happened, maybe not for a decade, maybe for longer than that. But, we've had this kind of two forces and desire on the both sides to have some kind of best-on-best tournament.
Okay.
That had happened in September 1972 is a miracle. And,
different Miracle on Ice. So,
yeah,
Chris,
I was going to ask about the Miracle on Ice. I mean, that was the famous U.S.-Soviet game, and to what extent, if you compare the two, could there have been that Miracle on Ice with the same sense of expectation if there hadn't been the 72 Summit Series? How do you think the two interplay? Obviously, we cheered in the U.S. when it was the Miracle.
Well, and why don't you think about that question, and we're going to buy you some time by taking a little break, and when we come back, you can compare and contrast, and we'll bring it to present day also.
Look forward to it.
Are you red, white, and blue, or just red and white? Beaver or bald eagle? Ryan Reynolds or J-Lo? Canusa Street, a masterclass in cross-border relations. This is where Canada and the United States intersect on the policies and issues of our two great nations. But you know that already. That's why you're here. The question is, if you want more of this bilateral bonanza delivered directly to your inbox, and you know you do, how about signing up for Scotty Greenwood's weekly email updates on Canada-US relations? Head to cabc.co to sign up today. And now back to Canusa Street.
It's 50 years and I still get goosebumps.
You need to understand what 72 was. You need to know the history, the month, the lead up, the drama, the politics, everything that was ingrained.
It was the Cold War at that time. But for a 4-week period, everyone put down their weapons and said, hey, we're going to have this battle on the ice. But we're going to shake hands when it's over. That was a great example for people in Canada and people in the Soviet Union.
Down that way, here's a shot!
The 72 series was an icebreaker for a lot of reasons.
Here's another shot, right by the goal!
It was the greatest hockey that was ever played.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everyone. We're talking about the 1972 Summit Series between Canada and then the Soviet Union. And our guests are Ambassador Gary J. Smith, author of a new book, Ice War Diplomat, Hockey Meets Cold War Politics in the 1972 Summit Series, and Andrew Holman, who is a professor at Bridgewater State University and the author of the book, Hockey: A Global History. So talk to us a little bit, if you could. We left our audience with a
big cliffhanger.
A big cliffhanger.
Right, yes.
Talk a little bit about what Americans tend to remember, which is the Miracle on Ice, Lake Placid, Olympic victory over the Soviets. To what extent was the hype or the idea of that really set in the mold in people's minds, their expectations, because of the 72 Summit Series?
And I think it's, I mean, there's certainly some similarities there, but it's difficult to draw a direct line that, you know, the New York Times covered it, other American outlets covered it, but it just didn't have the same kind of gravity in the United States as it did in Canada. And so part of that helps to explain why 1980 is so big. Now, I talk to my students. I teach a freshman writing skills seminar on hockey, and I talk to them.
I'm sure that's a popular class.
They know all about 1980, but they know nothing about 1972, and so I'm only too happy to tell them. The changes that take place after 1972 are gradual, right? It's not as if 1972 opens the floodgates for Soviet players to come over and play in North America. No, that takes until the next decade before we see that take place. And the question about amateurs versus professionals, who constitutes an amateur and who is a professional, that's not resolved immediately by 1972 either. It's this best on best opportunity that we have that allows for that one shining moment. And so the Olympics continue, and in 1980, when we have the Miracle on Ice take place in Lake Placid, it's still this kind of mythical amateur on amateur competition. And so it's within that realm, or under that light, that the great Herb Brooks, recruits his college kids who, were paid a stipend to play for the U.S. team and trained and combined Russian tactics with North American tactics and come up with this massively improbable win. I think the Miracle on Ice puts hockey on the map in the United States in a way it hadn't been before. The United States, of course, they won the 1960 Olympic title, and they had a number of world championship teams that were really very good. Great talent in Michigan and in Massachusetts and Minnesota. But the idea of a hockey team representing a nation really isn't crystallized until 1980. One of the big measures that I would look at as to hockey coming of age in the United States, 1980 is a symbol of that, right? If you look at the rosters for the best collegiate teams in the United States right up through to the mid-1970s, there are heavy numbers of Canadians who have been recruited to come and play on those teams. And what the Miracle on Ice says to people is, we don't need to recruit Canadians anymore. We've come of age in terms of the way in which we produce the talent, and it's continued on since then. The United States produces something like 26 or 27% of players in the National Hockey League, the very best league in the world. Canadians are now 44, something like that, which is maybe 50% less than what they were back in 1972.
They were 98% in 1972, so that's a dramatic change. Yes.
98% of the players in the NHL in 1970
were Canadian.
And what percentage is it today, roughly?
43, 44, yeah. And the big change is the increase in Americans, but it's the increase in Americans and foreigners. So the Swedes, the Finns, the Slovaks, the Germans, the Russians, that's where the internationalization of the game in North America has happened. And you go, down the street here, and there's Alexander Ovechkin playing.
Here in
and it's a little controversial given what's happening in the world now, hey?
Yeah, Chris? Indeed. But I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, about something that just occurs to me. I mean, you look at the U.S. and China, and Canada moves ahead of the Nixon administration to open up relations with China. You look at Miracle on Ice, Canada moves ahead with the 1972 series. What is it about Canadian diplomacy, and I'm not just trying to flatter you, but that gives you that instinct that has, in some ways, gazumped the U.S. and made openings diplomatically with seems to me, a little bit of creativity, a little bit of daring, but also some risk-taking.
Yeah, well, I think you can add to that list Trudeau visit to the Soviet Union.
Sure.
It was in May 71. Nixon came in May 72. It was a massively important visit with the ABM Treaty and START Agreement and so on. But the fact that I think Canadians moved more quickly is due to the fact we have less constraints. You get the Prime Minister deciding something in a parliamentary system and things can happen, whereas in the United States with checks and balances and all the issues with the military having a point of view on things. So there's a lot more to consider here in the United States than there is in Canada, and therefore, particularly with Trudeau, said, all right, I want to make that overture to the Chinese and to the Soviets, and let's play the hockey before the Americans do.
I wish we could talk all day because this is a lot of fun and slightly less nerdy, Chris, than we normally do. I have to say, a little more.
It's a different flavor of nerd, I think.
But we're coming up to the end of our time, and I guess I'll take the privilege of asking all three of you, and I'm including you, Chris, because we've been haven't given you as much airtime as we normally should.
It hardly matters.
To give us a few just concluding thoughts very briefly on the summit or on hockey today or on the global situation today, whatever you want. And we'll come around the table and we'll start with you, Professor Holman.
Sure. Well, to keep it on the 1972 summit series, I can't really emphasize strongly enough just how important this was as a trigger, a kind of pivot for opening up the sport and bringing about big change. I mentioned this a little bit earlier on, but it does underline that whole notion of sport being a great vector for soft power and public diplomacy. And it's not just at the most elite levels. Mm-hmm. I've told the story to Chris before, so he'll forgive me, but when I went to Moscow in 2016 to give a paper at the World Hockey Forum, a friend of mine said, well, are you going to bring your hockey gear with you? I thought, God, I never thought of that. So the next day, I contacted Aaron Annabelle, who was working here in Washington at the embassy then. Now he's in Chicago as the consul general. He's our
Canada's consul general there, yeah.
General, yeah. And he said, well, I know somebody in the Moscow embassy.
To give you gear.
He sent an email. It was within hours I heard back from some guy called Evgeny, who said, I heard you're looking for a game. Evgeny and his buddies got together every Sunday night at the Seska rink, which is the Red Army rink. Yeah. And sure enough, I brought my gear, so did Julie Stevens, a professor from Brock in St. Catharines. And the two of us went and got to play hockey, took pictures with everybody, and so this whole notion that hockey diplomacy just operates on the highest level, I think is not true. That it's true for youth teams, it's true for beer league guys like me.
It's universal. It really is. Chris Sands.
Well, it just reminds me, my colleague here at the Wilson Center and the director of the Kissinger Institute on China in the U.S. Has been working with us on a program looking at China and Canada after the two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou. But one of the reasons that he wanted to partner with me, not just because he's from upstate New York and has a place on the St. Lawrence, so looks at Canada all the time, but also because when he was in Beijing in the 1990s, he played a pickup hockey game. He was the goalie on the Canadian Embassy team, playing, again, the Russians.
Pretty good for an American kid. That's
pretty good.
Robert Daly, right?
Yeah, Robert Daly, who played goalie and was a great contributor in the team. And those relationships that he forged, just playing hockey with fellow Canadians, Graham Shantz, a diplomat for Canada, now runs the Canada-China Business Council. And the two of them get along great because they're on the ice together and they were having these experiences. So there's something to be said for this. And I think it's a great contribution that Canada's made and a great reminder that when we ice over Canusa Street, we ought to have some pickup games in the middle of town. But Ambassador, last word to you.
Well, we did have an American goalie in '72 for the Moscow Maple Leafs, the beer league team I played on, and he was an American Marine, so I recall that.
Oh, hoorah.
Yeah, hoorah. The thing that there are two things I'd like to mention, if I might. Ukraine.
Yes.
There's a very, very nasty invasion underway here, and we don't know where it's going to go. But
Ukraine's going to win.
Yeah, I don't want to go out on that fence just because war is unpredictable.
Yeah,
you don't know which way it's going to head. But the important thing is to keep relations going with the Soviet Union. Keep our embassies in Moscow, eyes and ears and a voice. And hockey from '72 onwards has been a bridge between Canada and the Soviet Union. And as a matter of fact, just a month ago, the Russian Minister of Sports issued a statement for the Summit Series, and he talked about the hockey bridge. So there are those transmission belts, lines of communications that we need to make sure go on, between the NHL players and back home to see if we can find some way that we can deal with the situation so it doesn't get out of control. The second thing is, we've got a scandal in Canada now on hockey.
Yeah.
A sex scandal.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, a sex scandal. And it comes back to the whole thing that this isn't about old white guys anymore, talking about '72. It's about inclusivity, and it's about fairness, and it's about providing a safe environment in which everybody can go out and enjoy our national sport. And I'm very happy to see that we're now finally wrestling with this issue with women's hockey, kids hockey, people who've come from around the world to come to Canada and learn the game, but we're always sort of looked down upon, or there were nasty comments made. So we're finally addressing a problem that's been with us for a long, long time, and it's time.
Well, thank you for that. What a interesting discussion. We're about to go listen to you guys and a couple more on a panel for the Wilson Center. By the time this podcast is aired, probably the Woodrow Wilson Center site will have links to your chat. And of course, everybody should buy Ice War Diplomat. It is the latest book that we've been talking about the '72 summit. And Andrew Holman, Gary Smith, it's really good to see you guys.
Same here, Scotty.
Thank you. Great to see you.
We're going to have to change this podcast, Chris, to only talk about sports. That was so much fun. Sports and diplomacy. I think it's a good, maybe we'll launch a new I don't know, but I just found this a great discussion. And Canusa Street manages to bring together all kinds of people. And you managed to bring together some wonderful scholars, authors, diplomats. So thank you. This was such a blast.
Well, you're welcome, although I don't think it's really the credit to them for putting this together. And I think we easily forget that Canada-U.S. relations is strong because it's a friendship between the peoples, and those moments that we shared. Talk about the '72 series. There were Americans watching and cheering on the Canadians because, of course, they were on our side of the Cold War. There are endless stories of sports and events that have brought Canadians and Americans together. And what this book shows, what Ambassador Smith's example shows, and Professor Holman validated, is that it still works, that it can go across not just two countries very similar to each other, but it can include people on opposite ends of a very nasty conflict. And there's great hope in that.
Yeah, and credit to the Wilson Center, I have to say, for hosting the book talk, because it's awkward for the Canadian Embassy at this moment, whereas everyone knows, we're at war with Russia. There's no doubt about it. And, you know, it's not to end on such a heavy note, but it is important, and the Olympic movement tells us this, that sports continues a different kind of engagement even when we're fighting on the battlefield. And I think Ambassador made a very important point there at the end about that. And so it's good when we can get together outside of official channels to keep dialogue going, even when the official channels are literally dealing with war. The other thing, and maybe we'll talk about it in a future episode because I don't want to understate it, is what's happening with Hockey Canada and the scandals. And what we do know is everyone goes through scandals, and everyone has to reconcile with their past. And so the important thing is to recognize it and take the right steps. And again, that's a topic we can explore. I didn't mean to shrift it at the end there, but I'm glad he raised it, because you can't talk about hockey today in Canada without at least acknowledging what's going on.
Well, and the other thing you brought up, of course, was the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And many of our Canadian listeners will know perhaps the most famous contemporary or recent hockey player in Canada, the great one, Wayne Gretzky, is Ukrainian. And, you know, he's spoken out about the war and been very much trying to raise awareness. So sports figures have a way of reaching us when talking heads, certainly boring think tank guys, don't. They have a cultural resonance that puts politics to one side and touches on something very honest and human in all of us. And so the role of sports in diplomacy, the role of culture in diplomacy, and I know you've done a lot of this with art and so on, It really is an important part. And as much as we focus on what fits in the newspaper's world section, and that's all that matters, actually, there's quite a lot between two countries, between two different peoples, that sports can bring out, and even if it's competitive, can still bring us to a resolution where we accept the score and we cheer for the best guy on the other team just because we appreciate the sportsmanship.
That's exactly right. And I'll just leave with a shameless plug, Chris, which is there's something called the Congressional Hockey Challenge.
Oh, yes.
It's a nonprofit game. It's legislators versus lobbyists, and it's played to benefit charities here, and the NHL is a partner, but it's literally members of Congress playing against advocates. And we at the Canadian American Business Council have supported this match because it's played for charity, because it brings Democrats and Republicans together, but also the legislators found over the years that they were losing too many games to the lobbyists, so they decided to make it a Canada-U.S. game. So they bring in members of parliament to increase their odds. So it's a Canada-U.S. It's not just Congress versus legislature. Anyway, so Congressional Hockey Challenge is a wonderful cause, and people should go check it out. We'll be supporting it when it comes around. So Google that. Google Ice War. What is it?
Ice War Diplomat.
Ice War Diplomat, and we'll see you next time on Canusa Street.
We'll see you next time. And honestly, that was a great way to end, Scotty, because if we started this podcast talking about how hockey brought Canadians and the Soviet Union together at the height of the Cold War, if Canadians and Americans can play a charity hockey game in Washington, overcoming all of the polarization in Washington, it is powerful, this thing called sport.
That's right. And we beat the buzzer. See you next time.
See you next time.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.